Well, good morning. Good morning. Good morning to you too. It is Friday. Yes, TGIF, and we are so excited to have an opportunity to kick off the day with you to have some food for thought relative to engaging workforce partners in equity. As already noted, OCCRL is about the work of how we can advance opportunities in community colleges for students to have further education and or move to gainful employment. And so part and parcel to our mission is strengthening pathways, and in particular, strengthening bidirectional authentic relationships and partnerships that can advance students' educational and economic mobility. And so in terms of, getting us moving today with, again, food for thought, is that we wanted to have an opportunity to tell you a little bit in terms of landscape analysis. We know that we have many worker learners who do not have the same opportunities, that there's disproportionate disadvantaging relative to particular segments within the labor market. And we also know that while we love to have students pursue particular programs of study within a guided fashion, i.e. guided pathways, that is not a panacea to making sure that students are not stratified or segmented within the incremental credentialing pathways and how those can lead to on-ramps to what we hope is greater mobility within the labor market, particularly with our local workforce partners. So not all programs, as you know, lead to earnings that are commensurate with skill sets, let alone the backgrounds of those that are participating. And we also know that that plays out where race and ethnicity can exacerbate as opposed to mitigate what we see in the way of the labor market outcomes, job quality, undermatching, all of that is in play when we think about some of the challenges as well as the barriers to participation. And then conflating this is, again, an issue of skills and the extent to which individuals have readily opportune times to upskill, to reskill, and for employers to also think about the value proposition and how we can diversify the pathways to what are those middle jobs, jobs that are high wage, high income, high impact, that again create more opportunity and mobility and provide families with an earnable, sustainable wage, as well as an industry recognized credential. So at the core of what you see intersecting in terms of this visual and circle here is interrelated and is overlapping when we think about equity. And there's a question mark there because while equity should be the through line and should be centered, often it is relegated to something that is an afterthought and not really put up front. And so as we think about the various stakeholders within this ecosystem of us wanting to advance equity and racially just outcomes and experiences for students, that we have to be cognizant to bring along additional partners that are external to our organizations and our institutions. And so we know that there's a wealth of opportunities for growth as we think through and work through what are the realities of our demographic changes and shifts in terms of a greater diversity, where we are going to, and in some cases in parts of the country, have a majority minority in terms of racially minoritized folks collectively being the majority. And we know that there still is that tension CCR in terms of college and career readiness, as well as the opportunity gap. So how do we engage students? And how do we think through, especially as we are still grappling with COVID-19 and the pandemic? How do we think about some of the real challenges that lie before our worker learners in terms of reasons that they can't necessarily get those opportunities or are choosing to do different pathways and not having the onus just be on blame shifting, but thinking about what it is we can do, not if the students are ready for us, but are we ready for them? And how do we bring our local companies along for the ride as they think through what can be the value added for not just themselves, but for us and the students as we try to navigate some of these challenges for everyone, and making sure that students are thriving, that we're creating, that we have job creation and are developing and contributing to the local community in ways that provide folks with adequate supports and wraparound services, and understanding that equity is an imperative to how we can impact the community on our campuses and beyond, in terms of increasing business outcomes and outpacing what might be competitors, and providing folks with, again, upward mobility. So one way of thinking through some of this, and we won't belabor because this is kind of a speed round session, is to think of it as multi-tiered, multi-layered, in terms of how do we move through creating opportunities that are equitable opportunities for workforce and workforce development, as well as thinking alongside with our industry partners, what are some of the benefits and how we need to do this work unpeeled in terms of individually, interpersonally, at an organizational level, in terms of campus-based, and then beyond that to more structural pieces that we need to understand in order to have a win-win-win, win for us, win for the students, win for our employers, as we think about what are some of the options for how we build out bi-directional, authentic partnerships to advance equity imperatives. One way of visualizing and thinking through this is to again do some level setting, thinking about what is the definition of equity within your college. How is that then parallel or aligned with your industry partners? How are you doing problem identification in concert with one another in terms of regularly partnering, working through and hosting opportunities for growth to think through and explore how you're transitioning students to the employee base within the local community? Do they have the requisite skill sets in terms of competency-based skills, and thinking through what matters in terms of what works and evidence that works. And I'm going to use this as a way to kind of popcorn over to Marci, who will talk to you a little bit more about how you can operationalize that in terms of an approach, in terms of how you define equity, and some of the choices that can occur for these authentic partnerships with workforce.
Thank you, Dr. Ziggy. Good morning, everybody. And so as we think about how we establish, partnerships that are going to advance equity, and we think about that logic model in action, one of the first steps is really defining and operationalizing equity. And so we know that, sometimes DEI work or equity can become a word that we use, but we might not actually define what it means. So if we're trying to bring an industry partner to the table and say, we want to do equity work with you, well, what does that mean, right? So what's your institution's definition of equity? Do you have one? What's your industry or workforce partner's definition of equity? Do they have one? And what if nobody has a guiding definition of what equity is? So, right, so that's kind of step one, to say, do we actually know how we're defining this? Because that's going to narrow the scope of what we're trying to do together. And also we need to have that definition so we can be intentional about what we want the outcome to be. So we can go into the next slide. So once we think about, how we define it, how we operationalize it, because again, if we're bringing somebody to the table to say we want to do equity work with you, we have to explain what that means. And we have to have some shared goals. So once we know what we're talking about, when we're talking about equity and what we want, what does an equitable outcome look like for this partnership, then, we can start to look at what inequities exist across education and employment in your area. What are the economic development goals in your region? And so, we've referenced quite a bit in our presentations recently, the Illinois Strategic Plan for Higher Education, and so how do we connect, again, the comprehensive local needs assessment being an opportunity to look at all of these systems where community colleges really sit, in the center of reaching all of these places where we have an opportunity to address inequity. So how do we connect those to economic development goals? And the other thing is, when we think about our goals, or, sometimes I think we can get caught up in like, what the challenges are, but how will we actually accomplish goals related to equity, or how will we actually accomplish economic development goals if we don't address equity gaps, right? So we can't, and again, our strategic plan for the state, talks a lot about, it's sort of that if you always do what you've always done, you're always going to get what you always got. So what are the economic development goals, and how are those going to be accomplished if we don't talk about and address equity gaps? And then how could your institution be a leader in centering equity in conversations? So again, maybe your partners don't have a definition of equity. Maybe this is new to them. How could you be a leader in defining that and in having it lead the conversation? And then also, which industries or employers are doing equity work? So again, even, I have lived and worked always in central Illinois, and I know that increasingly, even in my own community, I live outside of Decatur, Illinois. I've worked in Springfield and Decatur and Champaign. And so, I know that there's equity work happening, there's racial equity work happening. So how can you look to see, who's doing equity work? And how might you leverage partnerships to be a part of that and be a leader in it? So we can go to the next slide. So one of the challenges, I guess this is just kind of an example, we've provided this past year technical assistance related to program review. And so I just kind of pulled an example from manufacturing, because I think, again, it can be challenging to maybe think about, well, we're not really sure what to do differently, or how do we get started? And so even if things aren't happening maybe in your local level, or even people are hesitant to enter the conversation or don't really know how to enter the conversation, there are things that are happening. So even if you look outside of your local context, this comes from manufacturing. So we recently worked with a program review related to manufacturing programs for a district where, they saw some projected growth. Also super homogeneous current workforce. And so, thinking about, well, what can we do within manufacturing? And so I just kind of pulled some examples, and you can see that some of this comes from Milwaukee, or one of these comes from that work shift series that I know we've talked about in other presentations, and then racial equity in the future of manufacturing. So even if something isn't happening right in your context, or maybe your manufacturing partners, aren't talking about racial equity or aren't talking about equity at all, what can you learn from the initiatives of other places that you look at other community colleges or employers that are actually doing this work in isolation themselves in other places? So even if it's different from your context, these conversations, these resources, these are initiatives that are happening. And so how can you look at sort of what's happening more broadly, for example, to diversify manufacturing, both by gender and race, ethnicity, and then what can you learn from that? So even if you're getting resistance, what can you learn from looking at what's happening in other places? And also, as we talked about, even the payoff for employers, what kinds of things are happening for these employers that are part of these initiatives that you can start to share or discuss. So these are just some examples of that. So then when you go into, again, thinking about opportunities, because again, sometimes these might be conversations that are new to your industry partners. But what kind of discussions could you initiate or lead as it relates to the consequences of doing nothing about workforce inequities, right? So what's the future of your region if you choose to not do anything, to not address racial inequity, to not address the inequities that affect your district that we have within our state? What does that mean for the future of our economy, of our community colleges? And so, having those conversations, and then how could you use these interactions to shift the conversation from perceived individual deficits to system deficits? So, right, this idea that, and even some resistance of And again, these things come up where we say, well, these deficit ideas about what groups of people do or don't do, right? And the ways in which, and I know the keynote yesterday really got to a lot of these biases and assumptions, right, that are made and not really understanding the historical context. So how can you use these interactions to shift the conversation from, individual deficits to looking at the system? So what is it about our system that's not working, that's keeping people out? What is it about our culture as a college or as an employer? So I've been in those advisory meetings as a career services person in, fields that are entirely dominated by white males that are of the same generation, right? And so hearing sort of people say, well, we're not sure why women, aren't applying, or we're not sure why we're not attracting racially minoritized populations in our area. And thinking like, if we can't even talk about the fact that, this is a entirely homogenous group of people, that's a problem. If we can't talk about race, if we can't talk about, understanding what led to where we are right now and why the culture of this particular trade or profession is not diverse in the first place, right? Because that's not by happenstance, right? That's intentional. So how do we understand the culture? How do we be part of those conversations? And that can start with your advisory committees, your program reviews, and again, your CLNA. And so how can you be a leader in creating opportunities, even if people aren't necessarily talking about it in spaces where you're not working with them? And then we'll move into the next slide. And so one of the things I just wanted to highlight, this came through Community College Daily. I don't know if any of you subscribed, but it really highlighted the work of College of DuPage in Illinois on how they are leveraging resources towards stability and growth in their area. So it was sort of, written to think about, hopefully, as we're looking at the labor market coming out of the pandemic, and how can you leverage resources? And so some of the things that were highlighted there are helping small businesses to thrive in your area, developing strategic partnerships, and also use apprenticeships. And I saw a question, and I know hopefully at the end we'll have some time to talk, but having paid apprenticeships and opportunities, and even those manufacturing examples, when we think about diversifying the workforce, paid apprenticeships, internships, paid opportunities, right, to work and earn are huge. So how do you think about using those intentionally? And so when you think about these three things, how can you be conscious about race, right? How can you be intentional about saying, we want to really be specific here about who it is that we want to advance in economic mobility through these partnerships? And so at this point, I'll turn it over to Dr. Dyer-Barr, who's going to talk more about strategic partnerships.
Thank you, Marci. Okay, so we know that community colleges have a huge role to play in getting students into the workforce through, just the low cost and high quality education and training that they provide. And so this is especially important right now, with the huge documented need for skilled workers across the various sectors and industries. So the development of these, robust relationships and partnerships between community colleges and industry partners is critical to building, the various workforce development and education programs that can be offered to students. And these partnerships are especially critical right now, at a time when, as a country, we're trying to recover economically from the pandemic, because they can create these pipelines and pathways for more people and more diverse and inclusive groups of people in particular to enter the workforce quickly. So I just wanted to spend a little time talking about practical ways to develop these partnerships with your local businesses and industries, and doing it with an eye towards equity and racial equity in particular. So I first want to talk about some of the ways that these partnerships can work and be beneficial in meeting the mutual goals of community colleges and industry businesses. I'm seeing a lot of messages in the chat that you can't hear me. I'm not sure. I'll just try to speak louder. Um, but the partnerships are really useful because they can help community colleges. Oh, next slide, please. Are really useful because it can help community colleges better and more adequately identify the local labor market trends and needs. So as community colleges prepare students to enter the workforce through, the upskilling opportunities and training programs, working together in these partnerships, they can develop programs, curriculum, and credentials to meet the specific local labor needs. These partnerships also help industry partners diversify the labor force. We know that community colleges enroll significant numbers of students from low income and underrepresented backgrounds. And so these partnerships can help companies hire people who will diversify their workforce by actively recruiting and hiring from community colleges and utilizing these community colleges as creators of pipelines and pathways into various different sectors. Community colleges and industry partners can also work together to ensure there are opportunities for advancement in the fields. So they can offer, stackable credentials and pathways for advancement. They can develop a variety of training opportunities that allow students to enter the workforce quickly, not only to meet their own immediate employment and financial needs, but also, as well as the local labor needs, but also that these opportunities that allow students to continue to pursue a degree or credentials that further advance opportunities for upward mobility in the field and economically. So some of the ways community colleges can cultivate and sustain these partnerships with advisory leaders is through targeted outreach. When developing these partnerships, you want to use specialized outreach to approach industry and business leaders with a clear ask and a suggested role. So it's suggested that colleges spend some time researching and really thinking about how what they offer aligns or can better align with the prospective employer's values and needs. You want to go beyond having industry partners or employees serving in purely an advisory role, and you want to really engage them. Make a strong effort to develop partnerships that utilize what each partner brings to the table. So a lot of times the role of industry partners can be very limited. It may be where the college only engages in informal conversations with employers about their needs, or they have representatives on advisory boards that meet a couple of times a year, or they only connect with employers to serve as to come to career fairs or speaker series. And these are all okay, but you want to take that engagement with partners to another level. You want to have a strategic vision and clear articulation of how the partnership and activities are mutually beneficial and or lead to improved programs or student outcomes. Industry partners who are meaningfully involved and engaged they're more motivated to continue and sustain the partnership long term and engage in a variety of central activities like the apprenticeships that we talked about a little bit earlier. The ultimate goal of these partnerships is to build complex and multidimensional partnerships. You want to move from employers simply serving on advisory boards and offering general advice on workforce issues and labor market needs to employers partnering with colleges to design training for immediate workforce needs or contributing to industry-led efforts to prepare students for jobs. And take that even further to employers and colleges working together to analyze workforce needs and developing curriculum and training to meet those needs, like through, again, apprenticeships. Apprenticeships in particular is one specific avenue that allows for these more advanced ties and deeper engagement between community college and industry partners. They allow industry partners and community colleges to work together to offer student opportunities to participate in the earn and learn model, which is really important and beneficial for community college students, in particular when many of them have to work and earn money while also trying to further their education. So in these kinds of partnerships, community colleges can offer credit-based and non-credit education that delivers technical instruction that leads to industry recognized credentials, and can also serve as facilitators of apprenticeships that are, essentially formalized routes to meeting local industry needs. Community colleges might also want to consider using a liaison to help develop and strengthen and maintain these relationships with workforce partners. And that could involve, hiring staff or someone who understands the structure and missions of community colleges and industry, and who has the credibility, with businesses and industry and other education and workforce development partners. And that could be an internal person, or it could be, like I said, you might have to hire someone. And finally, you want to develop a coordinated effort to engage industry partners. And this could involve really just rethinking the roles that industry plays in shaping college programs and how colleges engage with industry. You want to deepen your partnerships between colleges and other workforce and training providers in the area and efforts to gain sustained commitment from your partners. And ultimately you want more students prepared with the skills and experiences that they need to succeed in careers that pay families sustaining wages. And so to do this, community colleges can't operate in silos or leave, the development and cultivation of these partnerships up to, a certain department and programs. You want to have a well-coordinated industry engagement effort and have college leadership. Having college leadership involved is crucial. So engaging your president to set a consistent vision and message for the college as a whole, and key faculty and staff who are directly involved in industry engagement and efforts is critical. So as you work to build support within the college, you want to look for college leaders who have strong relationships with business and industry, and you want to bring them into your efforts early on. Get their ideas about how to broaden and deepen employer engagement throughout the college, and also how to build on existing efforts. You don't want to just scrap everything you've done. You want to build on it. And so just in wrapping up, when developing these partnerships, you want to make sure that you're doing it with equity in mind. You want to make sure that your industry partners are aware of and committed to equity issues. We know that access to sustainable wage, jobs, and careers is a key equity issue. And so you want to pursue strategic partnerships with partners who have an explicit initiatives and agenda aimed at addressing equity gaps. We know women and racially minoritized people at all education levels, overwhelmingly make up the workforce in lower paying jobs and are often tracked into particular occupations, despite their suitability or earning potential. And so you want to have partners that recognize that job training can either be a bridge to more financial stability, or it could be a funnel to concentrate certain types of job seekers into low-wage occupations. And you want to make sure that your strategic partners are advancing equitable outcomes. And so these are just a few of the things that you can do as you seek to develop and cultivate and maintain these strategic partnerships with industry leaders. And I see we're at the end of the PowerPoint, so did we want to open it up for questions or?
Thanks, Raina. We are a little over time, and in lieu of that, if you would like to follow up with us, please feel free to do so. We have ways in which you can connect and stay engaged, and that we welcome and invite you to have additional conversations with us beyond the forum. Just as a FYI, if you're not familiar with the Council for the Study of Community Colleges, please note that OCCRL houses the council, and there is an upcoming conference in Tempe, Arizona, and you can see the call for proposals on our site. Again, this is our contact information. We appreciate the leadership and invitation of ICCB, as well as our colleagues and peers at ISCPS. We thank you for your time and attention, and hope you have a good rest of your Friday.
thank you so much. If we were live, you'd hear a big round of applause. That was a fantastic session. So thank you both, all three of you, so very much for your presentation this morning. Gave us a lot to think about and some phenomenal resources. With that, we are going to move into breakout sessions. Those will start at 9 a.m. And make sure I'm telling you the right time. No one's blowing up my phone. So 9 a.m. And then we want to encourage you to come back at the end of the session, at the end of the day today at 1:30 and join us for a general session again. Jennifer, are there any additional closing comments?
No, I would just say that thank you to OCCRL for your presentation. Definitely food for thought. Thank you.
Thank you all. See you this afternoon.